All right, strap in. Picture this. It's August 1943. The United States and Canada are about to launch one of the biggest amphibious invasions of the Pacific Theater. We're talking 34,000 troops, soldiers, infantry, elite mountain fighters, backed by 100 warships, enough firepower to level a small country. They've been training for months. They've got artillery, air support, naval bombardment, and enough testosterone to bench press a destroyer. The target? Kiska Island, Alaska, a frozen, fog-choke rock in the Aleutian chain that the Japanese had occupied since June 1942. This was going to be the battle to kick Japan out of North America. The generals were ready. The troops were ready. The planning was flawless. The only problem? The enemy had left 2 weeks earlier. And yet, somehow, the Allies still managed to rack up over 300 casualties, including 32 troops who got unalived by their own side in friendly fire incidents. Oh, and a destroyer hit a mine and lost 70 sailors because apparently nobody thought to sweep for those. This is a story of Operation Cottage, the military equivalent of kicking down a door, yelling surprise, and then accidentally shooting your own foot, your buddy's foot, and the family dog. Before we watch these tactical geniuses ruin everything, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button. Why? Because clearly, learning from history is optional for some people, like the commanders in this story. But you're smarter than that. You're not about to lead a platoon into a volcano or invade an island the enemy literally abandoned. So join the club of people who actually pay attention. Subscribe, ring the bell, prove you're not destined to repeat this kind of brain-melting incompetence. Now, back to the dumpster fire. The Aleutians, America's forgotten war zone. Let's rewind. June 1942. The Japanese just got their teeth kicked in at the Battle of Midway, one of the most decisive naval defeats in history. But before that loss, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had cooked up a brilliant diversionary attack, bombed Dutch Harbor in Alaska, and seized a couple of islands in the Aleutian chain to distract the Americans. Spoiler alert. The diversion didn't work. Midway was a disaster for Japan, but they did manage to occupy 2 freezing, miserable islands at the edge of the world, Attu and Kiska. And honestly, nobody really cared at first. These islands were remote, barren, and about as strategically valuable as a used tissue. But this was American soil, technically, and the optics of Japanese troops planting a flag in U.S. territory, while Pearl Harbor was still smoking? Yeah, that wasn't going to fly. The Aleutians became a PR nightmare. Americans back home couldn't stomach the idea of enemy boots on their soil, even if it was soil most people couldn't find on a map. Politicians demanded action. Generals promised revenge. And the military-industrial complex smelled opportunity. So the U.S. and Canada geared up to take them back. This wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was about pride, ego, and making sure the history books could say, yeah, we kicked them out. Enter the ego parade. The commanders, confidence without competence. By 1943, the Allies had decided it was time to evict Japan from Alaska. The operation fell to a dream team of military leadership. Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid and Major General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. These guys were the elite, the best and brightest, the kind of officers who probably had their own personalized stationery and never once questioned their own genius. Kinkaid immediately established a naval blockade around Kiska and Attu, cutting off Japanese supplies. Or at least, that was the theory. In practice, the blockade was about as watertight as a screen door on a submarine. But we'll get to that later. Buckner, meanwhile, was itching for a fight. The man wanted blood, glory, and a promotion, probably in that order. He'd spent his entire career preparing for this moment. A chance to prove himself as a tactical mastermind. Unfortunately for everyone involved, he was about to prove the exact opposite. Their first move? Retake Attu Island in May 1943. And oh boy, did that go great. The Battle of Attu, a preview of horror. The Battle of Attu turned into a 3-week meat grinder. The Japanese garrison, cut off, starving, and outnumbered, fought to the last man. When defeat became inevitable, the remaining defenders launched a massive banzai charge, screaming through the fog with bayonets and grenades. The ones who survived that final assault, they self-checked out with explosives rather than surrender. The Allies won, but at the cost of nearly 4,000 casualties, 550 Americans sent to the Shadow Realm, another 1,200 wounded, and over 1,500 more evacuated for trench foot, frostbite, and psychological trauma. It was brutal. It was bloody. And it was a preview of what island hopping in the Pacific was going to look like. Slow, miserable, and soaked in tragedy. But here's the thing. The Japanese High Command saw Attu and thought, yeah, we're not doing that again. The evacuation nobody believed. By late July 1943, it was becoming pretty obvious that something was up on Kiska. Aerial reconnaissance noticed that routine activities had basically stopped. Bomb damage wasn't being repaired. Anti-aircraft fire had dropped to almost nothing. And on July 28th, radio signals from the island went completely silent. Analysts looked at the photos. Pilots flew over and reported the island looked desolate and unoccupied. One bomber crew literally said it appeared abandoned, with no visible movement or defensive activity. So what did Allied intelligence conclude? Nah, it's probably a trap. Because obviously the Japanese, who had just watched their Attu garrison get annihilated, would totally stick around on Kiska, an even more isolated island, and wait for 34,000 angry Americans and Canadians to show up. That makes perfect sense. Definitely not the kind of logic that gets people sent to the Shadow Realm by accident. In reality, the Japanese had executed one of the slickest evacuations of the war. On July 28th, under heavy fog that would make a horror movie jealous, a small task force of cruisers and destroyers slipped through the Allied blockade like ghosts. They pulled out over 5,000 Japanese troops in less than an hour, scuttled equipment, planted booby traps and mines, and left behind exactly 0 soldiers. It was a masterclass, and let's get the hell out of here before this turns into Attu Part 2. But the Allies, they refused to believe their own intelligence. The commanders had spent months preparing for a massive, glorious battle. They had 34,000 troops locked and loaded. The Navy had shelled the island with 330 tons of ordnance. The Air Force had dropped 424 tons of bombs. There was no way the Japanese would just leave, right? The arrogance of certainty. This is where the hubris really kicks in. The Allied commanders were so convinced Kiska was still occupied that they ignored every single red flag. No radio signals? Must be radio silence for ambush purposes. No visible activity? They're hiding in bunkers. Pilots reporting an empty island? They're lying low to sucker us in. It's a military version of, I'm not wrong, reality is wrong. Admiral Kincaid, despite his decorated career and reputation for competence, fell into the same trap. He'd invested too much in the operation to back down now. Pulling out would mean admitting they'd wasted months of planning, tons of ammunition, and countless man-hours on an enemy that wasn't even there. Better push forward and confirm the situation on the ground. General Buckner was even worse. After the bloodbath at Attu, he needed a decisive victory to justify the campaign. His pride wouldn't let him consider the possibility that the Japanese had outsmarted him with a simple retreat. So they pressed ahead. The invasion plan was locked in. The troops were briefed. The 7th Infantry Division, the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, and the 13th Canadian Infantry Brigade were all chomping at the bit, ready to storm the beaches and kick some serious tail. This was going to be the redemption arc after Attu. Clean, decisive, glorious. What could possibly go wrong? Spoiler, literally everything. The stage was set. The egos were inflated. The intelligence was ignored. And in a few days, 34,000 Allied troops were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous enemy on the battlefield is yourself. So, you've got a fortress-sized invasion force about to hit Kiska Island. Sure, Attu was a horror show, just bodies and bad memories all around. So everyone's expecting round 2, even bloodier. Here's the twist. Kiska was emptied and the promises on officers resumed, and all their high-tech toys and brilliant plans were about to run face-first into reality, with a side of fog so thick you're basically fighting inside a carton of expired milk. Let's talk about those warning signs. There were enough red flags here to decorate the entire Kremlin, and every single one was ignored harder than a caution. Wet paint sign on a submarine. Red flags, more like ignored parade, ghost town recon. For weeks leading up to the invasion, pilots doing reconnaissance flybys kept telling headquarters the same thing. Guys, there's nothing moving down there. No patrols, no construction, no fixing bomb damage, no signs of life at all. The Japanese, who'd been meticulously maintaining defensive positions for over a year, suddenly stopped all activity. Anti-aircraft guns weren't firing anymore. Why? Because there was literally nothing to shoot. But the brass decided, classic Japanese trick. Pretend to be dead, then jump out with a sword. Who knew? Maybe they'd spring out of the tundra like historical whack-a-moles with grenades. Dead silence radio. On July 28th, radio transmitters on Kiska just stopped. Complete silence. Zero chatter, no encrypted codes, not even angry weather reports. The analysts went, "This is highly unusual, possibly indicates a tactical retreat." The generals went, "It's obviously a trap. They're lying in wait, probably with ninjas and cyborgs and secret underground bunkers." The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Every piece of evidence pointed to evacuation, but because it didn't fit the narrative they constructed, massive final battle to avenge at 2. They simply refused to believe it. Fog. Nature's way of protecting the stupid. You would think that launching an operation where everyone's main enemy is weather would ring some alarm bells. The Aleutians are infamous for brutal, unpredictable conditions. 50-mile-per-hour winds, sideways rain, and fog banks so dense they could be mistaken for solid walls. But instead of waiting for better conditions, they pushed forward right into one of the thickest, moodiest fogs the region had ever seen. Visibility dropped to less than 6 feet. Soldiers could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. Perfect conditions for coordinating 34,000 troops with zero margin for error, right? What could possibly go wrong when you can't see, can't communicate, and everyone's trigger happy? The briefings. This is fine. Everything's fine. Picture the officers gathered around the sand table, coffee in hand, blowing smoke like it's a Renaissance portrait. Listen up. This is going to be tough. And we expect the Japanese hiding everywhere. Stay alert. Trust your maps. Check your corners. Problem number 1. The maps were straight-up garbage, outdated, vague, and missing critical details about terrain, minefields, and defensive positions. Some of the topographical data was from surveys done in the 1920s, before modern military standards even existed. And what about local guides or indigenous scouts who actually knew the terrain? Nah, those were for nerds, not battle-hardened, elite planners. They told the soldiers to just go forward and hope their compasses weren't made by Fisher-Price. Problem number 2, inter-unit coordination, was a joke. American and Canadian forces were landing on opposite sides of the island with instructions to sweep inland and meet in the middle. Sounds simple, right? Except nobody had clear communication protocols. Recognition signals were poorly distributed, and half the radios didn't work in the fog anyway. It was a recipe for disaster, and everyone could smell it cooking. Soldiers, confused, soaked, and still following orders. You ever see highly trained mountain fighters paddle rubber boats 2 miles through freezing surf at night, in the fog, to charge onto a beach nobody had ever properly mapped? It's the kind of fun you only find in war movies, or catastrophically bad military planning. Soldiers, Americans, Canadians, the famed 1st Special Service Force, basically history's first attempt at a super soldier team-up, the precursor to modern special operations, all felt something was deeply wrong. Reports of no resistance did trickle up the chain of command. But hey, orders are orders. When a general tells you to take a beach, you take the beach, even if every instinct is screaming that something doesn't add up. The only thing thicker than the fog was attention. Every soldier jittery, finger on the trigger, convinced a bonsai charge or sniper was lurking behind every tuft of tundra. They'd been psychologically prepared for At-2 2.0. Brutal close-quarters combat, fanatical resistance, and high casualties. Instead, they got silence. Eerie, unsettling silence. As soon as they hit the beach, the confusion went off like fireworks. The enemy was not shooting, but the officers were absolutely certain the Japanese had to be hiding in caves, tunnels, or were somehow invisible. So, naturally, everyone was told to shoot first, ask questions later, at any shadow, sound, or unlucky shape that looked vaguely foreign or, let's be real, Canadian. Dumb Decisions Hall of Fame. Maps that lied like a campaign politician. The 1942 vintage maps were missing entire hills, valleys, and, crucially, locations of friendly units. So when platoons fanned out across the island, everyone's coordinates were basically somewhere near Steve, we think. Which meant, yeah, Americans firing on Canadians, Canadians firing on Americans, random magazine dumps right into friendly foxholes, because nobody could see past their rifle barrel, and everybody assumed contact meant enemy contact. One unit set up a defensive perimeter and spent 45 minutes exchanging fire with what they were convinced was a Japanese strongpoint. Turned out it was a Canadian reconnaissance patrol doing the exact same thing. By the time someone figured it out, 3 men were wounded and everyone was out of ammo. No plan for weather, because planning is for losers. Sure, the island is internationally famous for unpredictable storms, gale-force winds, sideways rain, and fog thicker than cold gravy, but planning for weather is apparently for mere mortals, not tactical masterminds. Troop movements fell apart almost instantly. Platoons got separated within minutes of landing. Radios jammed or couldn't penetrate the fog. Visibility dropped below, bathroom with the lights off. Friendly fire incidents skyrocketed because nobody could identify targets beyond vague silhouettes and panicked assumptions. Is that a Japanese helmet? Oh, it's Jerry from headquarters. Jerry takes a permanent nap before anyone realizes a mistake. Booby trap bingo and landmine lottery. The only defensive action left on Kiska was what the Japanese had thoughtfully left behind. Landmines, explosives rigged to delay fuses, and tripwires connected to artillery shells. The Allies walked right into it like tourists at a theme park, except the rides were designed to send you to the Shadow Realm. Some units progressed slower than a government approval process because their combat engineers, aka human ping-pong balls testing for explosives, had to clear everything manually. This didn't stop officers from yelling, "Move up, we're behind schedule," while half the company tried desperately not to lose a leg to some wire buried in volcanic ash. Blockade failed the greatest hits. Remember that impenetrable naval blockade Admiral Kincaid was so proud of? The one that was supposed to prevent any Japanese ships from getting in or out. Yeah, about that. The Japanese task force sailed right through it under cover fog, evacuated 5,000-plus troops in under an hour, and sailed back out without anyone noticing until days later. It's like hiring a security guard who falls asleep, and the burglars not only rob the place, but also leave a thank you note. And even after the evacuation, the Navy continued bombarding the island for weeks, wasting hundreds of tons of ammunition on literally nothing. Some sailors joked they were destroying enemy morale by proving how much Ordnance America could afford to waste. Morale, less for victory. More, are we sure about this? The soldiers quickly figured out something was catastrophically wrong. No enemy snipers. No machine gun nests spraying lead. No mortar fire. No screaming bonsai charges. Just fog, cold, and an increasingly strong suspicion that someone upstairs had royally screwed up. After days spent in mud, freezing rain, and zero visibility fog, the biggest danger became abundantly clear. It wasn't the Japanese. It was their own side, or the booby traps, or the mines, or tripping over volcanic rock and breaking an ankle, or hypothermia, or accidentally shooting a Canadian who wandered into the wrong sector. Meanwhile, officers still clung to the belief that any minute now, the Japanese would pop out screaming. Except that moment never came. Instead, someone stumbled upon a makeshift kennel with a couple of confused dogs the Japanese had left behind because they couldn't fit them on the evacuation boats. One dog, famously nicknamed Explosion, became the unofficial mascot of the operation. The dog was the closest thing to an enemy combatant they found. Building tension. Laughter meets tragedy. We thought this would be Act 2, Part 2, Tokyo Drift. We planned for a battle, but the only fight was with the terrain, with malfunctioning gear, and occasionally with each other. The fog and the miserable cold meant seasoned troops genuinely joked that the only thing more dangerous than the Japanese was the idiot general on the radio barking orders he didn't understand. Officer on radio, advance with caution toward grid reference Alpha 7. Soldier on the ground. Sir, we can't see grid reference anything. We can barely see our own boots. Officer. Then advance toward where you think Alpha 7 is. It was a masterclass in military planning by committee, except the enemy committee had already left the mainland, probably laughing the entire way. Last-minute launch. No turning back. Midnight, August 15th. Troops in rubber landing craft head for shore. Seasickness and existential dread rolling together like a toxic smoothie. Ship captains could barely see their own anchors through the fog. The ocean was black, the sky was black, and morale was also pretty black. Landing without opposition should have been a relief. Instead, it made everyone even more nervous, because surely, only the dumbest enemy in history would let 34,000 dudes stroll ashore without firing a single bullet, right? What could possibly happen next? Maybe the generals would finally figure it out and call the whole thing off. Maybe things would get better once dawn broke and the fog cleared. Maybe someone would realize that firing machine guns into the mist at nothing had some pretty obvious downsides. Spoiler, none of that happened. August 15th, 1943. 0 hour. The fog is so dense you could package it and sell it as discount insulation. Visibility? Maybe 6 feet on a good day, and this was decidedly not a good day. 34,000 troops, Americans and Canadians, plus the ultra-elite 1st Special Service Force, basically the John Wick squad of World War II, paddle ashore expecting hell on earth. They're psyched up for bonsai charges, grenades, and a last-stand bloodbath just like At 2. Instead, they get silence, fog, and the faint smell of abandoned coffee brewing stations. The beach landing? Unopposed. Not a single bullet. Not even a dirty look. And that's when things went spectacularly wrong. The fog of war. No, seriously, literal fog. Picture this. You're a 19-year-old infantryman from Iowa. You've been told for weeks that Kiska is crawling with 10,000 fanatic Japanese soldiers who would rather self-check out than surrender. You've seen the photos from At 2, bodies stacked like cordwood, guys with grenades clutched in dead hands, the whole nightmare fuel catalog. You're mentally prepared to fight for your life. Now you're standing on a freezing volcanic rock. Can't see past your rifle barrel, and nothing is shooting at you. The silence is absolutely deafening. Every shadow could be an ambush. Every rock could conceal a sniper. Your buddy next to you is breathing so loud you're convinced the enemy can hear it from a mile away. Except there is no enemy. The Japanese packed up their suitcases, brewed one last pot of coffee, grabbed their dogs, and ghosted the island 2 weeks ago in the slickest evacuation of the war. But nobody told you that. So you're creeping through the fog, finger on the trigger, heart rate at about 200 beats per minute, adrenaline maxed out, ready to mag dump at the first thing that moves, which, unfortunately, turns out to be the Canadians. Friendly fire, a masterclass in, oh God, oh no. Here's the thing about fog, terrible maps, and paranoia. They make the absolute worst combo platter in military history. American units landed on one side of the island. Canadian units landed on the opposite side. The plan, and I use that word very loosely, was to sweep inland, meet in the middle, and crush the Japanese between them like a really aggressive hug. Except the only thing in the middle was more fog, confusion, and mounting panic. One Canadian soldier, nerves absolutely frayed after hours of zero contact, spots movement in the mist. Adrenaline takes over. He fires. The Americans, hearing gunfire, assume they finally made contact with the enemy and return fire. Hard. Really hard. Within minutes, machine guns are rattling, mortars are dropping, rifles are cracking, and everyone is absolutely convinced they're fighting the Japanese Imperial Army in a desperate battle for survival. Spoiler alert, they were not. Over the next several days, 28 Allied soldiers were sent to the Shadow Realm by their own side. Another 50-plus were wounded, some seriously by bullets, shrapnel, and sheer catastrophic bad luck. The elite 1st Special Service Force, hyped as the most lethal unit in the entire theater, spent part of their first major combat deployment accidentally engaging their own allies. The Canadians sustained 8 total casualties from friendly fire, 4 bought the farm, 4 were wounded, all from a deadly mix of poor visibility, worse communication, and trigger-happy troops who've been psychologically primed for fanatical resistance. The supreme irony? The Japanese didn't fire a single shot. They didn't need to. The Allies were doing their job for them, and doing it with terrifying efficiency. The realization, wait, where is everybody? Day 2, Day 3, still absolutely zero enemy contact. Patrols sweep the island methodically. They find bunkers, completely empty, barracks, totally abandoned, anti-aircraft gun emplacements, unmanned and cold, supply depots stripped bare or sabotaged. One particularly confused patrol stumbles upon a kitchen area with a fresh pot of coffee still sitting on a stove. Nearby, some stray dogs the Japanese couldn't evacuate wander around looking for food. An officer radios back, voice dripping with confusion. "Sir, we found dogs and coffee. Still warm. No enemy personnel." Admiral Kincaid, back on the command ship, reportedly quipped with dark humor. "The Japanese are very clever. Apparently their dogs can brew coffee." The joke didn't land well. People were dying and nobody could explain why. But the grim joke was wearing thin fast. Soldiers were still getting wounded. Not by enemy fire, but by mines, booby traps, and timed explosives the Japanese had meticulously planted before they left. For more troops took permanent naps courtesy of tripwires and buried ordnance. Progress slowed to an agonizing crawl as combat engineers had to manually sweep every inch, all while officers screamed at them to move faster. Because surely, the enemy was just hiding really, really well. The USS Abner Reed, tragedy on water. By August 18th, reality was starting to sink in like an anvil through wet paper. And then the USS Abner Red, a Gleaves-class destroyer sitting in Kiska Harbor providing fire support, hit a floating mine left behind by the Japanese. The explosion was catastrophic. It tore off a massive chunk of the stern, ripped through bulkheads, and sent 70 sailors to the Shadow Realm almost instantly. Another 47 were wounded, some horrifically burned, others crushed by collapsing metal. It was the single deadliest incident of the entire operation, and it happened because nobody thought to properly sweep for mines and water they supposedly controlled. The Navy had been so focused on bombarding an empty island that basic mine-sweeping protocols, literally Naval Operations 101, got ignored. At this point, even the most optimistic, promotion-hungry commander had to admit the horrifying truth. There was nobody here. The island was a ghost town. They'd invaded an empty rock and still managed to lose over 300 people. The elite versus harsh reality. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer comedic tragedy here. You've got the 7th Infantry Division, battle-tested veterans, supposedly hardened from brutal Pacific combat. The 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, elite Alpine fighters trained specifically for rough, unforgiving terrain. The 13th Canadian Infantry Brigade, tough-as-nails units like the Rocky Mountain Rangers and the Winnipeg Grenadiers, guys who could survive conditions that would kill most people. The 1st Special Service Force, literally the precursor to modern special operations, commandos, saboteurs, the guys you call when you need something blown up quietly and professionally. And collectively, working together, they stormed an island with exactly 0 defenders and still racked up casualties like they'd just fought the Battle of Okinawa. The problem? Nobody could see anything. Units got hopelessly lost within hours. Patrols wandered into each other like drunk tourists in a haunted house. The radios didn't work half the time because of atmospheric interference from fog. Maps were worse than useless. They were actively misleading. At one point, an entire American platoon set up a defensive position, dug in deep, and waited tensely for the inevitable Japanese counterattack, only to realize hours later they'd been aiming directly at a Canadian patrol doing the exact same thing barely 50 yards away. Pure luck nobody opened fire. It's like watching an NFL All-Star team show up to the Super Bowl, only to discover the other team forfeited months ago, and then they all trip over their own shoelaces, sprain their ankles, and somehow lose anyway. The officers, awkward silence intensifies. Back at headquarters, the mood shifted dramatically from glorious victory parade to, please God, don't let this get out to the press. General Buckner, who'd been hyping this operation for months as a triumphant revenge tour for At 2, now had to explain how his meticulously planned invasion resulted in 92 deaths and 221 wounded fighting. Literally nobody. The excuses started rolling in faster than a politician caught in a scandal. The fog was completely unprecedented. It wasn't. This is Alaska. Fog is practically the official state bird. The Japanese left extensive booby traps. True, but that's literally basic strategy 101 when you evacuate a defensive position. Our intelligence was incomplete and inconclusive because you personally ignored all the reconnaissance clearly stating the island was abandoned. One after-action report desperately tried to spin a disaster as a tactical success with acceptable losses because they successfully secured a strategic objective and eliminated Japanese presence from North American territory. Sure, you secured an empty rock. Congratulations. The Japanese must have been absolutely terrified watching you fight yourselves from the comfort and safety of their ships, already hundreds of miles away. The peak of absurdity. On August 24th, after 8 soul-crushing days of stumbling around in the fog, accidentally shooting each other, tripping over mines, and slowly realizing the horrible truth, the island was finally declared secure. Secure from what exactly? Aggressive rocks? Territorial seagulls? The only confirmed enemy combatant was one very confused dog named Explosion, who'd been left behind and seemed genuinely happy to see people again. Final casualty tally: 92 Allied soldiers dead, 221 wounded, some permanently disabled, 0 Japanese soldiers encountered, 0 enemy shots fired, 0 combat engagements of any kind. The Battle of Kiska was officially over, and the only actual winners were the Japanese, who'd pulled off one of the cleanest, most embarrassing for the other side retreats in military history, while the Allies bombed an empty island for weeks and then invaded like they were storming the beaches of Normandy. Somewhere in Tokyo, Japanese naval officers were probably laughing so hard they spilled their sake and had to apologize to their ancestors for the disrespect. So the fog finally lifts. Well, sort of, because this is Alaska, and the weather barely cooperates even when you're not accidentally fighting your own army. By August 24th, after 8 days of sweeping Kiska from one frozen, miserable end to the other, the island is officially declared secure. Secure from what? The only confirmed enemies were leftover landmines, a handful of booby traps, and one very confused dog named Explosion, who seemed genuinely thrilled to meet new people. Final tally for Operation Cottage: 92 Allied soldiers sent to the Shadow Realm. Another 221 wounded, some with life-altering injuries. 0 Japanese casualties. 0 enemy engagements. 0 enemy shots fired. The Japanese had pulled off the slickest ghost move in military history, and the Allies had just fought the battle of absolutely nobody and somehow lost. Let's talk about what happened next, because oh boy, the cleanup and cover-up were almost as messy as the operation itself. The cover-up? Let's just never speak of this again. You'd think after an embarrassment of this catastrophic magnitude, heads would roll, courts-martial, demotions, public firings, maybe a very stern talking to at minimum, just to restore some faith in military leadership. But this is the military, where accountability is more of a polite suggestion than an actual requirement. Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid, the guy who ignored literally all the intelligence, insisted the Japanese were definitely still there despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and Greenland invasion of what was essentially a frozen ghost town. Did he get fired? Nope. He got promoted. Kincaid went on to command the 7th Fleet and became a key figure in the retaking of the Philippines, where he actually did some legitimately competent work. Because apparently, nothing says reward for catastrophic failure like getting a bigger boat and more responsibility. General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. also kept his job, no questions asked. In fact, he later commanded U.S. forces at the Battle of Okinawa, one of the bloodiest, most brutal campaigns in the entire Pacific theater. Tragically, he was killed by enemy artillery fire in June 1945, just days before the battle ended. It's a genuinely tragic end for him personally, but the irony is thicker than Alaskan fog. The guy who presided over the Kiska disaster, where his forces fought nobody and still lost 300 people, went on to lead one of the deadliest island assaults in history. As for the junior officers and enlisted men who actually had to deal with the chaos on the ground, they got medals for successfully liberating American territory and a very stern, very unofficial reminder not to talk about the friendly fire incidents in public or to journalists, ever. The official after-action reports were, let's generously call them creative. They emphasized the successful recapture of Kiska, the elimination of Japanese forces from North American soil, and the strategic importance of denying the enemy a forward base. What they conveniently left out was the whole, we shot each other in the fog for a weak situation. The PR spin, mission accomplished, sort of back home in the continental United States. The American public got the sanitized, Hollywood-friendly version of events. Newspaper headlines screamed things like, Allies retake Kiska, and Japanese driven from Alaska, victory complete. Technically true, the Japanese were gone. They just happened to leave before the party even started. The military brass framed Operation Cottage as an unqualified tactical and strategic victory. The island was back in Allied hands. Japanese forces were no longer a threat anywhere in the Aleutians, and American soil was secure once again. Cue the patriotic music and flag waving. What they conveniently failed to mention was the 70 sailors who bought the farm when the USS Abner Red hit a mine in water they supposedly controlled, or the 20 Americans and 4 Canadians who took permanent naps courtesy of friendly fire, or the dozens more who got maimed, burned, or traumatized by booby traps because nobody bothered to properly scout or sweep the island before sending in 34,000 troops. One military historian later called Operation Cottage a cautionary tale of assumption, perception, and catastrophic command failure. Academic translation. They assumed the enemy was there, perceived every shadow as a mortal threat, and then shot the absolute hell out of everything that moved, including, tragically, themselves. The soldiers, traumatized, confused, and silenced. For the troops who were actually there, the ones who lived through the fog, the fear, and the horror, Kiska wasn't funny. It wasn't a quirky historical footnote. It was genuinely terrifying. Imagine being told repeatedly you're about to storm a heavily fortified island defended by 10,000 fanatical enemy soldiers, psyching yourself up mentally for a fight to the death, and then spending an entire week stumbling through fog so thick you can't see your own hand, dodging mines and booby traps, and slowly realizing that half the explosions you're hearing are your own guys panicking and mag dumping at shadows or worse, other Allied units. Veterans of Operation Cottage rarely talked about it afterward. It wasn't the kind of war story you told proudly at the local VFW bar. It was humiliating, confusing, and deeply traumatic. The enemy didn't even show up, and you still lost friends. Some guys stepped on mines and got blown apart. Some got clipped by friendly fire and bled out before medics could reach them through the fog. Some drowned when their overloaded landing craft capsized in the freezing surf. And for what? A frozen rock that the Japanese had already written off as strategically worthless. One soldier, interviewed decades later, said the worst part wasn't the danger or even the casualties. It was the embarrassment. They'd trained for months, hyped themselves up for a glorious battle, and then had to live the rest of their lives with the knowledge that they'd invaded an empty island and still managed to catastrophically screw it up. The historians roast why this was peak military stupidity. All right, let's break this down with surgical precision. Why is Operation Cottage widely considered one of the absolute dumbest, most preventable military blunders of World War II, and possibly in all of recorded military history? Number 1, they deliberately ignored their own intelligence. Reconnaissance pilots literally and repeatedly said the island looked completely abandoned. Radio signals stopped cold. Bomb damage wasn't being repaired. Defensive activity dropped to absolute zero. The evidence was overwhelming, consistent, and impossible to misinterpret. And the commander's conclusion? Nah, that's way too convenient. Must be an elaborate trap. Because obviously, the Japanese, who had just watched their entire Attu garrison get systematically annihilated in brutal close-quarters combat, would definitely stick around on an even more isolated island and wait patiently for 34,000 furious Americans and Canadians to show up for round 2. That makes perfect tactical sense. Definitely not the kind of galaxy brain logic that gets people sent to the shadow realm by friendly fire. Number 2, they launched in the absolute worst weather imaginable. Fog, so thick you can see your own boots. Wind strong enough to flip rubber landing craft like pancakes. Freezing rain that soaked through every layer of clothing. And the brass looked at these conditions and decided, yep, absolutely perfect for coordinating 34,000 troops across multiple landing zones with zero margin for error or communication failure. It's like planning an outdoor wedding during hurricane season, and then acting shocked when everyone gets soaked and the tent blows away. Number 3, the maps were catastrophically inadequate, outdated by decades, inaccurate in critical details, missing entire geographical features like hills and valleys. Units got hopelessly lost within hours of landing. Patrols wandered into each other like drunks in a corn maze. Nobody knew where anyone else was positioned, so naturally, people shot first and asked questions never. Number 4, friendly fire killed more people than the actual enemy. 28 Americans and 4 Canadians were unalived by their own side. Not because they were poorly trained, these were elite, highly competent soldiers, but because the leadership created an impossible situation and then acted genuinely surprised when things went catastrophically sideways. Number 5, they didn't properly sweep for naval mines. The USS Abner Red, a fully operational destroyer, sailed confidently into Kiska Harbor and promptly hit mine, losing 70 sailors in the explosion. This wasn't some freak accident or bad luck. Minesweepers exist specifically for this exact purpose. But apparently, someone in command thought, the Japanese probably didn't leave any maritime surprises. Narrator voice, they absolutely did. Number 6, nobody in leadership faced any consequences. The ultimate kicker, the cherry on top of this disaster Sunday. After this colossal, preventable failure that cost hundreds of casualties and became an international embarrassment, the officers in charge faced exactly 0 consequences. Kincaid got promoted to a bigger command. Buckner kept his job and his reputation intact. The only people who truly suffer were the enlisted men and junior officers who had to live with the trauma, the injuries, and the crushing knowledge that their friends died for literally nothing. And the families back home who received telegrams saying their sons were killed in action retaking an island that had already been abandoned by the enemy weeks earlier. The final word: learn from history or be doomed to repeat it. Operation Cottage is a masterclass, a graduate-level seminar, in what happens when institutional ego, catastrophic planning, and deliberate ignorance of intelligence collide at high speed. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the biggest threat on any battlefield isn't the enemy across the line. It's your own leadership refusing to admit they were catastrophically, embarrassingly wrong. The Japanese didn't need to fire a single shot. They didn't need elaborate defensive plans or heroic last stands. They just had to execute a clean, professional retreat and wait patiently for the Allies to do their job for them. And honestly, it worked better than anyone could have possibly imagined. They evacuated cleanly, left a few nasty surprises behind, and watched from a safe distance as 34,000 troops invaded an empty island and suffered over 300 casualties doing it. So here's the lesson, and I cannot stress this enough. Pay attention. Question the plan. Don't ignore your own intelligence, especially when it's screaming that something is deeply wrong. And if every single indicator is clearly saying, this doesn't make sense and we should reconsider, maybe, just maybe, don't charge ahead anyway because your ego demands a glorious battle and a promotion. Final call to action. Don't be like these guys. Subscribe and learn. If you made it this far through this entire disaster of a story, congratulations. You've now learned infinitely more from Operation Cottage than the Allied commanders did from the entire operation combined. So here's the deal. Hit that subscribe button right now. Why? Because history is absolutely overflowing with examples of people making the same catastrophic mistakes over and over again. And you specifically are better than that. You're the kind of person who actually learns from other people's failures instead of blindly repeating them and expecting different results. You're not going to invade an empty island. You're not going to ignore your own reconnaissance because it doesn't fit your preferred narrative. You're not going to accidentally shoot your own troops because you refuse to plan for bad weather or invest in proper maps. Subscribe. Ring that notification bell. Join the exclusive club of people who actually use their brains and learn from history's most preventable disasters. Because clearly, some people throughout history didn't bother, and here we are, 80 plus years later, still talking about their spectacular failures and mind-boggling incompetence. Now go forth into the world, armed with the knowledge that even the so-called elite military minds can screw up spectacularly when ego overrides intelligence, and try your absolute best not to invade any ghost towns this week. Your future self will thank you.